Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everybody on this call. It's always a pleasure to see comment readers and members of our community from all over the place. It's great to see this. I see lots of different faces in lots of different places. Some people with beautiful backgrounds and others with blurry backgrounds, and it's all right. You're all welcome here anyway. I'm really, really pleased today to have Alberto La Rosa Rojas with us to speak about his article that is in our latest issue, which is on the theme of home. And I mean, I can't think of, there are a few things that I can think of that are as important as that. And Alberto's article is called A Theology of Migrant Experience. I highly recommend it to you. I often say that every issue of comment that comes out, I'm like, it's our best one yet. I just pretty much say that every time, and this was a good one. And there are some really, really quality articles in there that I recommend to you. If you don't subscribe to Comment, I will encourage you to do so. It's www.comment.org. I think it's /subscribe, but smash that subscribe button, and it's totally great. My kids are watching YouTube, so I am always on like smash that subscribe. And we don't have merch yet, but we'll work on that. But anyway, I want to welcome you, Alberto. I mean, I love the whole issue, but I particularly enjoyed your article, and I'm really glad that you can be here to join us. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just do a little bit of the professional introduction of you. So Alberto serves as assistant professor of theology and ethics at Western Theological Seminary, which is in the west of Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, in Holland, Michigan, which is, speaking of migration, where my parents come from, and not Holland, Michigan, but actually the Holland that Holland, Michigan was named after. So we're going to get into a little bit of this meta migration discussion. But he's a professor there, and he also directs our Hispanic ministry program. He lives with his wife, Anna, and he have two children, Simon and Penelope. And so, Alberto, I'm just really glad you can join us. I'm really grateful for your article. It meant a lot to me, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
I'm thrilled to be here, Brian. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and chat with you, and for the privilege to be able to write an essay and share it with your magazine subscribers. It's been quite a wonderful journey. Thank you.
Great. Well, good to have you here. And for those of you who are on the call, just so you know, we are going to leave a substantial amount of time for Q&A. It's something that I find often productive with the author. You can ask Alberto questions. You can ask us questions about the issue. So just so you know, as you're writing down, don't hesitate to drop those questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring them, and we'll come up and we'll try to drop those into that conversation as well. So, Alberto, I want to start with the most important thing that comes with home, which is food. And when we were preparing for this, we had a conversation about food, and you mentioned ceviche in your article. And ceviche, which, just for the record, as a kid who comes from a Dutch background, is like any other culture's food is superior to the Netherlands. And so ceviche, the sort of like bright and delicious food, but it's not just ceviche. So can you tell us a little bit about how, you've mentioned it in the article, but what does it mean? And how does that serve as a sort of metaphor for the broader point you were trying to get across in your article?
Mm-hmm. When I started to think and reflect on home, and I did my doctoral dissertation on home, and written lots of chapters and essays on home. And one of the first sort of obstacles that I hit is, okay, I have to define home for my readers, for my audience. I'm going to talk about home, so I got to tell them what home is. And of course, as I think the entire magazine kind of gets at, home is so hard to define, and yet we all feel how important it is. And so I actually find food a beautiful way of defining without defining, of talking about home in a tangible and concrete way, without giving it a kind of casing and a strict definition. And what I like about food, as you're reflecting on home, is that it brings in some of the aspect of home as memory, home as a place that you remember. Food carries memories with them, memories of what parents or family members used to cook at the house, smells, memories of places come really deeply attached with food. But food is also just deeply tangible, right? It has this quality of home is not just an ethereal idea that lives in your brain or a feeling, but it's also tangible. It's also fleshy. And the food that we make represents the places that we come from in important ways. The things that grow there, the things that thrive there. And that's another important aspect of home, the kind of ecological, the placeness of home. Home, of course, also, or food, of course, also has all these wonderful biblical resonances because it has to do with delight, and it has to do with desire. And so, even Jesus, I'm the bread, right? I'm the wine, because it has to do with this desire that's innate to humans that also seems to be an innate desire for home and for belonging. But of course, food can also be attached to stories of deep trauma and famine and drought. So there's that component. So food really brings a lot into the picture. But I think that the last thing I'll say about food, and maybe this has to do with ceviche specifically, is that many Peruvians like myself deeply associate our Peruvian identity with ceviche. And the Peruvians have a thing about food, actually, just in general. We really care deeply about our food, and it's one of the deep markers of our identity. But we think ceviche really defines us in a particular way. But as soon as you say that, you run into some complexity. Like, for example, there are places in Mexico, coastal cities. Maybe I'll butcher this. I think Veracruz is actually one of them that also have their own form of ceviche. And in fact, Ecuadorians claim a particular kind of ceviche, and Chilenos, people from Chile, claim a kind of ceviche. So you run into this thing of, okay, I thought that was us. I thought that was, our identity marker. And then comes something even more beautiful about this, what I think the story of ceviche. And when you look at the Peruvian ingredients that make up ceviche, because each region has its own ingredients that they put into the dish, there are certain ingredients that go into the Peruvian ceviche, which is very simple. It's lime, onion, cilantro, the fish itself, a little bit of salt and pepper, and some sides. Oh, no pepper, sorry. Oof, that's anathema to some Peruvians. Anathema. The chili is what I meant to say. Chili pepper, not the black kind of pepper. Some of those ingredients are grow in the Andes naturally. Some of those ingredients came aboard ships from Europe in the 1500s, in the 16th century. And so hidden in the story of ceviche, which is a story of home, which is a story of rootedness, which is a story of place and identity and belonging, is already a story of migration. And to me, that's kind of that paradigm, that dialectic that we always live in. How do we embrace the goodness of home, of identity, of belonging, of people, while also recognizing that all these stories of people and identity and home are always already stories of migration at the same time. So a little bit on ceviche there.
Yeah, no, I love it. A little bit on ceviche and a lot on theology and a lot on home. I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? You sort of talked about it as being tangible, but not cased, like not something that is, because you're right, there's a sort of fluidity to that boundary. I mean, you and I, when are preparing this to talk, we talked a little bit about the Italian experience too, right? The things that we consider classically Italian food, tomato sauces and that type of thing. Actually, the tomatoes came from the New World. They weren't part of Italian culture until there was that sort of overlap, which of course comes with all kinds of stories of oppression, but also of liberty and other things as well. And then it goes sort of back, right? Like the Italian immigrants to New York found those tomatoes, brought them back to Italy, and now we associate that with the sort of like encased, Italian food must be this way, right? And I think it's just a beautiful way of describing it. And I think a beautiful way of talking about food as something much deeper, because I know that in Canada, for instance, there's lots of times when we talk about immigrant experience, people love Indian food or they'll love like Peruvian food. There's a beautiful Peruvian restaurant, by the way, down in Hamilton, which when you join us here in Hamilton at some point, I'll have to take you to. um, but it becomes only about the food, right? So Peruvians are only about ceviche, but there's this deeper thing, like you talk about their families, traditions, and so on. um, and that sort of gets to another point that you talk about in your article, which is the difference between seeing Alberto as a sort of generic abstraction migrant, right? Like, you talk a little bit about being seen as Hispanic, and what that means. And I mean, you can maybe tell us a little bit about that beautiful stole you've got behind you. Uh, I'd love to hear that story, but tell us a little bit. Like you've talked about these sort of the difference between being Hispanic, which sort of makes Alberto as part of a generic category, but that's not really you. There's something deeper there. So maybe you can help us understand a little bit about, the difference between being Peruvian American and Hispanic, or other categories that people put on you.
Yeah, that's a big question, and we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about what does it mean to be Hispanic, and even among Hispanics or Latinos or Latin Americans or whoever you want to describe those who identify using these markers, we have all sorts of debates and conflicts about how we should self-define. But I think at the heart of that, if I were to go back to the article and think a little bit about the story there, so I'm sometimes what sociologists describe as generation 1.5 or even 1.75, because even though I'm
How
a
do you do the
first
math on that?
migrant, what's that?
How do you do the math on that?
Yeah, so they say, and I was just talking to my friend Johnny Vega, who works with me here in the Hispanic ministry program for Western, and he was born in the U.S., but he defines himself, or he describes himself as first generation because his parents migrated from Mexico. He was born here, so he's the first generation U.S. native, or whatever you want to call it. But for me, I'm the first generation is the first generation of migrants, and the second generation would be my kids who were born in the United States. So there's already tensions there. But I think of me as 1.5 or 1.75 because I came when I was 10 years old. And so I spent most of my formative years here in the United States. People always, when they talk to me, they say, you don't really have an accent. And my response is always, just wait until we hang out more and you'll hear it. Right. And so it's that kind of tension of, where am I from? Like, where's my identity to be found? And I grew up with that tension. I grew up trying to, on the one hand, having my parents who were deeply trying to make sure that our Peruvian culture was being preserved. And in Latin America, as I think in most places in the world, the country you're from, like we call ourselves Latin American in South America, which is where I'm from. But mostly we say I'm Peruvian, I'm Bolivian, I'm from Chile, I'm Brazilian, right? There's a kind of national identity that is more core than what we call the ethnic identity of Latin American. So my parents tried to really preserve that in me growing up. But in their very effort to preserve that, it was creating a tension in me where I couldn't find belonging. I couldn't find like I fit in at school and in the neighborhood, because there to fit in was to become American, right? Which is another problem term, because of course South Americans think, well, we're Americans too, just from the South. And so, but the more that I assimilated to, let's call it North American or US culture, the more that I became distant from my family. And I also found that it wasn't that I was just becoming North American. In order to fit into the North American system, and I'm thinking particularly here of the school where I went, I had to become Hispanic, right? I had to become a certain kind of American. I had to fit into the social imagination somewhere. And that social imagination that I fit into with these high schoolers, with these middle schoolers, later on with college kids, it was formed around, well, you're Hispanic or you're Black or you're white, right? Or you're foreign, which doesn't really make sense of, any of those categories, or you're Asian. And so the process of becoming Hispanic in order to fit in was also the process of losing part of my Peruvian identity. And it really wasn't until, I'll give you the precise day, actually. It wasn't until Willie Jennings came here to Western, where I was a graduate student, a seminary student, and gave a talk on the Christian imagination. I don't know if our readers or listeners are familiar with that book or what Jennings writes about, Willie James Jennings. But Jennings was presenting a different account of identity, one grounded in place, where the places where we're from have a formational quality. And I would love to talk more about why that is, I think, on theological grounds the case. But that sent me on a journey of, okay, so if place does matter, if where we're from does matter, how does that matter? How does that change my faith? How does that change how I act in the world as a Christian? And that led me down questions of what responsibility do I have as a Peruvian living in the United States to the people of the United States and to the people of Peru? What calling do I have in the world? But all of that was, again, going back, rooted in this tension of what does it mean to be Peruvian? What does it mean to be Hispanic? You know, how do these things, and I think Jennings would probably push against a little bit back against the Hispanic label because it's not really grounded in a place, right? If it's grounded in any place, it's grounded in Spain and in the Spanish.
Hispaniola.
Yeah. But I'll stop here. The word Latin American or Latino or Latina or even Latinx, those are also deeply problematic. As I understand it, Napoleon had a vested interest in it, in the Americas not being called Hispanic lands or Hispanic countries, because that excluded the French colonial presence, as well as the Portuguese would have been excluded. So Latin, making Latin the root, now it includes the French and the Portuguese as well, but that was an empire project. So there's no innocent describer here. So I'll leave it there.
No, it's again brilliant, and you know, I know that we have someone on our comment team who's originally from Brazil, and she may or may not balk at the label Latin herself, right? So you know, Latin American, we speak Portuguese. You know what I mean? There's a different culture, and even that is troubling, right? His attempt to do that, and so I want to sort of talk about one of those things. I think it was Salman Rushdie. I'm not sure if I gonna get that right, but he talks about the things that people who come from other places and settle in one place, you know, as your family did and as you did, it comes with all kinds of discomfort, you know, like you don't really fit in either places. To use a nice Canadian analogy, you're straddling two canoes. And you know that's a very difficult thing to do. And I just got back from the bush, and I tried that a couple of times, and it's either painful or you end up wet. So like, you know, but you know, there's also something that comes with having an eye in each culture, right? There's a, you know, just like, you know, you and I have two eyes and we can triangulate and see different dimensions.
Right.
Um, it seems like that's the case too for the migrant. And I just thinking theologically, Alberto, you know, it seems to me that the Christian life, you know, if you read the letter to Diognetus, some of these older texts that talk about, you know, the fact that Christians, by their very nature, are at home in the world, because of course, you know, there's the incarnation. Jesus made his home in our world. In fact, he made his home in the flesh. He tabernacled. I think that's literally what it means you know, he tabernacled with us in the flesh. But do you think that there's something about that sort of discomfort, and maybe it's a longing for home? Maybe you can just sort of talk about this and feel free to be personal as much as you wish or not wish, but just talking about how like there may be something about that longing for home that you sort of allude to in your article that is itself a type of like microcosm of that sort of deep longing. Like, is there, am I off on something there, or is there something there that we could explore?
Yeah. Well, I think that you threw a lot of really interesting things into the pot there. I mean, we could start maybe with the letter to Diognetus, where with that famous line, Christians are foreigners in their own countries, and yet they're also at home anywhere that they go in the world. This kind of dialectic, this paradox. As I've thought about the condition of being displaced and the longing for home, this has been a hard place for me to sit with in the Christian tradition, because a lot of people are quick to jump on that. I think I talk about this in the article in a way that sought to sort of sympathize with my situation as an immigrant, even as an irregular immigrant. So, well, we're all fundamentally migrants. We're all fundamentally not at our home. You know, we're made for another home. And then there's all these passages in the Christian tradition, you know, even Augustine with these lines about our hearts are restless until they find the rest in you, that suggests that the primary figure, the primary concern of the Christian is one of sojourner, of migrant, of being displaced, and that therefore we should embrace the longing and the feeling of we haven't arrived. And my first response to all that was to resist it and to say, I'm physically displaced. It's not just a kind of existential condition for me. And it doesn't feel like what God wants. It doesn't feel like what God wants for my life. I mean, it's been a source of great a trauma. And it's a trauma that actually largely goes unaddressed because, just to put it bluntly, those on the right are quick to say, well, you shouldn't have left. And those on the left are even quicker sometimes to say, welcome, welcome, welcome. We love you. We're so glad you're here. And there's almost no space to dwell on the deep loss, right? And so that led me to explore, well, okay, so is home good? Should Christians care about home? Or should we just embrace the kind of sojourner, the migrant experience and the pilgrim experience? And I thought there's actually a lot in scripture about the importance of rootedness and place. And at a very ontological level, the Adam is from the Adamah. There's this deep link in Genesis 1 between the first humans and the soil. And I started investigating. I remember Norman Wiersbe. It was really important for me because he talks about the importance of the biblical imaginary is not one of creation as a container for our lives, where our lives are just separated from and kind of floating, free floating in this container we call the earth, but rather that our lives are inextricably joined to places. That place is not a container. It's more like our mother's womb. It's more like we're attached embryonically to the places that we inhabit, both at an ecological level in the way that our bodies are shaped by the microbiomes and the ecological structures where we're born and raised, as well as at a social level in the ways that, and here indigenous theologians have done a lot of work too, right? That place matters, landscape matters, the animals that thrive where you thrive, they're a part of who you are, they're a part of your identity. So indigenous theologies of home, Norman Wiersbe and other eco-theologians thinking about we need to recover a sense of place as actually integral to the biblical imaginary, helped me to reestablish the seminal goodness of home. So then what to do with the longing for home and the pilgrimage stuff and the migration stuff? The way that I've reconciled it, and I could be wrong, and I'm welcome to, I welcome other people's thoughts and opinions, is that is more of a time thing than a place thing. That our pilgrim status, that our migrant condition, our kind of existential wandering, you might call it, has more to do with time than with place. It's not a permission to kind of be displaced and to not be rooted and to not care about where we are and the concrete realities around where we are. But it's actually a recognition that where we are, including ourselves, is not yet fully been transformed into new creation. That are the places we are and ourselves in those places, which are mutually constitutive forces, to get a little nerdy there for a second, all of us are awaiting the transformation of all things in Christ. And so, yes, of course, this place is not as it one day will be. I'm not as I one day will be. It is not fully my home in that sense, in that time sense, that we are awaiting the full consummation of all things in Christ through the Spirit, but not in the sense that, as many, I think, people have rightly rejected, that we're going to leave this place and go somewhere else, right? That's what I kind of have learned to resist and push back against. I don't know if that answers your question, but
beautifully, Alberto, beautifully. It's it's perfect. I mean, and I wanted to sort of bring a couple of things out that you talked about there. One is you talk about the sort of drive for home. In fact, that's to some extent the whole story, right? There's the being driven out of Eden, being east of Eden. It means you're not in your home, and the actual physical place. And I think too about that sort of long story of the patriarchs and others. Joseph, It could have been Joseph, and I'm going to try this on an Espanol. So just, you can laugh at me for my butchering of your beautiful language and so, but I'm going to try it because I want to honor it. You say they would finish stories. You're talking about your parents, urging my sister and me to keep a vow. Cuando mi muera, entierrenme en mi tierra. And which is like, when I die, bury me in my homeland, which for Pete's sake could be Joseph. He says, take my bones out of Egypt. And I just want to sort of like just note that you're 100% right, that the large portions of the story in the Old Testament and then renewed in the New Testament are actually stories about the Lord saying to his people, I'm going to give you a new homeland. And then of course, when they rebel and other things, it's the sort of the result of their sin is displacement. And I'm not saying, I don't want to project that onto the migrant experience, saying, oh, migrants are here because they've sinned. That's just terrible theology. But just to sort of allude to that sort of beautiful story about the scripture being a place filled with home. And even when Christ descends, he says, I'm not going to leave you orphaned. And an orphan is somebody, like, you talk about the home being a place where family is, where you're enwombed, or sort of, the language I think he used. So I just think that's brilliant. I think that's one of the things that you want to push back against, the sort of, the sort of the one side of that migrant narrative, that we're all just sort of pilgrims here. We are pilgrims on a journey, and which of course is true, but pilgrims are going someplace,
Right.
and they want to end up there. And so that's one danger.
Yeah.
But there's another danger too, right? That there's like homeland. I mean, the one danger is forgetting about the embodied nature of home. You cease to become a Peruvian with an actual history, with actual parents, with actual traditions, and you become some generic Hispanic, that checks some box on what is just what James C. Scott would call an attempt to, make you legible. So you're now just Hispanic. All your whole story gets fit into this little box that you check off, which is total. Yes, that's one danger, that we turn you into a box. But you allude to another danger, and we talked about this a little bit, about there are views of homeland that can themselves be dangerous. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like that challenge of what my mentor David Koyzis would call making an idol out of your nation or your home. But how does that manifest itself, and how do you thread that needle? It seems to me like you are trying to balance two canoes, or straddle two canoes. But maybe you can talk about the flip side of that, of somebody reading yours and being like, actually Alberto's a blood and soil kind of guy. How do you address that?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. It seems to me that the most corrupt lies that we can tell are just tiny little changes of deep, beautiful truths, right? Tiny distortions of good things. That's usually not that things are so far away from each other when it comes to truth and lies. I think, I've talked a little bit about nationalism. I think I may even have mentioned it briefly in the essay, that part of the condition of modern peoples is that we have lost a deep sense of our connection to the land and to the creatures of the land. In that loss, I would contend we have sought all sorts of ways of recovering some sense of home, but those ways that we've sought to recover a sense of home can be deeply destructive. So one way in which people have tried, I mean, in the midst of global changes, in the midst of mass migration, which changes the way your neighborhood has looked where you grew up, you can't really blame people for feeling adrift and lost. And if you don't provide people with, okay, but here's what it means to be at home in the world, it means loving your neighbor, like who is actually next to you, right? This is the problem with segregation in the United States, is that there were actually Black and white people living in the same neighborhood. They were living one block away from each other or one block behind the other, but they had no sense of their connection by way of their proximity to that they both depended on the same soil, that they both depended on the trees, that they both woke up and listened and heard the same birds singing, that this place was a sacramental place where they were called to encounter God. Instead of this kind of ground up understanding of home, they created a different understanding of home around race. I don't belong with the people that literally live next to me. I actually don't even have a sense of the trees and the animals that roam around me that my life depends on. What is home is those people who have the same skin color. What is home is the people that have the same religion, that have the same, you name it, right? And then even when you have that mix of same religion and same skin color, you start to get into some of these versions of white Christian nationalism. But it's not just in the United States. This happens everywhere. This happens in Peru as well, right? And where you have things like most of the food industry, most of where our nourishment comes from in Peru, comes from the Andes, which is the central region of the country. It's like the backbone of Peru. Since the time of pre-Columbus, that was the case. But when the Spanish came, they settled in the coast because of reasons of commerce and transportation of goods. And they built the biggest city on the coast, on the western coast, which is where Lima is. And so 10 million people live there. And these 10 million people depend radically on the farming that happens on the Andes and the farming that happens in the Amazon, which is in the far east side of Peru, for their sustenance. Well, when bad political decisions and political regimes and colonization destroyed farming in the Andes and in the Amazon and forced those people to lift their farms, internal migration to Lima, the people that were in Lima did not manage to see, this is my brother and sister, whose work from the soil, right, that we both call home, has sustained us both for decades, even for centuries. Instead, they saw, oh, those people look darker. Those people are more ethnic. We're mestizos. We're mixed European and native blood, which puts us closer to Europeans. And they created also these kind of racial social caste systems and deeply rejected the internal migrants that were coming from the Andes, upon whom their families had flourished for centuries. And so again, I think a return to the soil and to the land, a true look at, okay, who's my neighbor? Who am I depending on for my sustenance? Who lives around me? Which, granted, it can have some problems in areas that are deeply segregated, so all your neighbors do look the same. But the story of segregation in the United States, again, is not that they were living in different cities often. It's that the city itself was cut in half. Story of Chicago, for example. Yeah. So anyway, then maybe that begins to answer my question around. I actually think paying close attention to the importance of home and place and land could actually address some of the problems of nationalism and race that are actually distorted ways of cultivating a sense of home in the world, not by our shared life together in the land, but by some made up category of skin color or nose size or this fictitious history about how our people were formed that erases, as in the case of Peru, right? That erases the way that we were actually sustained and flourished because these other people here were also part of our story. So
Oh, it's good. And I just want to say that I win on no size. And I've got Salman Rushdie. I don't know if you've read. I love that one. I love that one because I'll win every time. Salman Rushdie. This is a different Salman Rushdie. I think it's in Midnight's Children. He still talks about a nose you can build a dynasty off of. And I'm like, the Dijkemas have that nose. We're very, very proud. Very proud of that family trait. Okay, seriously though, a couple of things. One is like, I do love that call. It says, when Jesus calls you to love your neighbor as yourself, it means your actual neighbor. Like, you don't, I think we often have this tendency, and especially as sort of Western Christians, to think, oh, our neighbor is this like, the neighbor, it just becomes neighboring. Like it becomes this weird sort of like, academics are guilty of this, but lots of people are guilty of this. They come up, the neighbor just becomes a category instead of like an actual person with actual needs who might need to borrow your socket set or might need a cup of sugar to make bread, right? Like,
right.
And so I just love that call. And I also love like your sort of call to sort of talk about the land. And I just want to allude to a poet in Hamilton. His name is John Terpstra. And he writes beautiful poems about the land, and particularly the land that our office stands on, which is right near. It's on the Shadok, and this is land that has been lived on by, Anishinaabe, Wendat people, indigenous people for like millennia prior to us being there. And there's this one, I think this person is Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, and he has this little epithet at the beginning of his book, and the person's name is Lee Maracle, and Maracle, M-A-R-A, like miracle, but with an A at the beginning. And he says, look, he's an indigenous person. And they say, Lee Maracle says, no, our hope is not to have the white person leave. We have no desire to see the white person leave. My hope is that they learn to love the land as we do. And
Mhm.
I've always found that such a profoundly gracious and beautiful way of understanding. Look, these people are here, we're all neighbors together. None of us get to control the empires and so on that brought us all here, the big mess of history. But we're here together. And what should we do to live together in peace and in love? And it's effectively that call to love the land and make it a home.
Mhm.
And I think, you talk about the food and the Andes versus Lima and so on. I think that has particular resonance in North America, both in the United States and in Canada, where a lot of our food is actually grown with the hands of migrants. And this is true in America, certainly. I mean, so much of our produce comes from California, and so many of the workers on those farms are are migrants. Some of them legal, some of them illegal. Certainly true. My first job was on an apple orchard, and most of my colleagues were Jamaican. Temporary foreign workers is what they were called. And there's a certain resonance there. And I think as Christians, I'm thinking liturgically, and I know there are a lot of clergy and church people on this, lay leaders and so on. How do you encourage your parishioners to live a liturgical life that remembers that? And I often think one of the places that we often underestimate, and this is just me thinking now, it's just you've sort of got me
Yeah.
going, is we underestimate the power of prayer before food. Like I think we often do it rote, just like Lord bless us food and drink for Jesus' sake, amen.
Mhm.
Um, but we should be saying prayers of thanks for the workers who brought it who worked the fields, the truckers who brought it, from California to our store, the grocery store workers, and these are people who often are migrants or immigrants, or it's their first job, right? I just think that's beautiful. Um, I want to ask one more question. It's 2:40. It's 2:40, and I want to leave lots of room. So, folks, if you're listening to this and you're enjoying it as much as I am, and you've got questions like I do, I'm going to be ending my questioning of Alberto, and I'm hoping you begin your questioning. So, feel free to drop it in the chat box, and I would love to hear from you. But Alberto, I want to ask one more question just about the nature of homes. We've talked about different levels. You've talked about the soil. You've talked about your family, the kitchen table. We've talked about the church a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, you're an American for a unique reason, and I mean like a legal American. And so maybe you can talk to us about the role that the state plays, like actual political
Mm.
what a community, like, is it possible for a political community to be a
Mm.
home? And I don't want to spend too much time there. I know there's a ton of time spoken about that in our news media. It's only about that, so I'm hesitant to even ask. But it does strike me that it is a piece of that puzzle of identity, and what it means to be home is to have certain legal status. I know Hannah Arendt wrote about this at the end of World War II, this challenge of so many people whose states didn't even exist anymore. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. And I don't need you to get into policy, but just thinking about what does that mean, the political community? You can get into policy if you want. I love that. It's my day job, but
Mhm.
maybe just respond to that, and then we'll hear from the guests.
Mhm. Um, I think there's even power in thinking about how changing how we think about home and connection to land and a sense of peoplehood around a shared sense of land. Um, I think if we take that as a starting place, that might help us to reimagine even how we do politics, how we think about the political, not just in terms of what those people in Washington do over there, what those people who are elected officials do, which is, and I'm indebted to my my mentor and friend Luke Brotherton on this, who's trying to get people to think much more broadly about politics, because we tend to think of politics again only as what happens with the actors in Washington, elected officials, and essentially the state machinery, rather than that's one aspect of politics. It's actually supported by the work of people on the ground trying to cultivate a shared common life, trying to learn how to distribute goods properly and justly, trying to learn to deal with conflict, with different visions of what the good life is, trying to, he's got this example that I love. When the pipe breaks in your street and it smells like poop, and he doesn't say poop, everywhere, it doesn't matter if you're regular or irregular, legal or illegal, Hindu or Christian or Muslim or upper class or lower class, it smells like poop for everybody. And so then at that point, with all these different visions of what it means to live a good life, with these histories of with these asymmetries of power, right? Those who have more power, those who have less, and these histories of oppression, how do you come together and fix the pipe? But what about when it's not a broken pipe? What about when it's a broken school system? Or what about when it's a broken immigration system, right? So it again comes down to, do you know who your neighbor is? And going back to something you said earlier, it's actually hard to know who your neighbor is if you don't know where you are or that you are at home. And it's actually central to the message that I've been trying to tell people is you're going to have a heck of a time helping immigrants who have lost home and are trying to regain a sense of home if you yourself don't understand that you are at home somewhere, right? That maybe perhaps your privilege blinds you to the gifts of your at-homeness somewhere. And if you don't understand the goodness and the importance and the significance of home and how your identity and is being really formed by the Holy Spirit, by the people and the animals and the trees and the land and the landscape that are all around you. And that's how you're thriving, and that's how you're communing with God and with creation, right? And so, so again, looping all the way back to your question about politics, I think I would like to say, if we have a politics that's centered on life on the ground, sort of grassroots, how do I learn to cultivate a common life with those who are not like me, with those who are even my enemies maybe, but who are yet my neighbors, because I am at home here and their house is right there across the street, to put it very concretely. That's also political. And I think that can have ripples all the way up to how we think about state legislature, how we think about not just the neighborhood, but the city, and not just the city, but the state, and, or province, and not just the city, state, and province, but even how do we share a common life between people who are part of this social contract called the United States and those who are part of that social contract called Mexico?
Yeah, brilliant, Alberto. I think it's like, it does actually, that framing actually helps us rethink the policy front. And I've often thought this too. I mean, Canada has a different immigration approach. We also have different realities than you. Like, we don't share a border with Mexico. We have, everybody wants to go to America. Canada's kind of second place. Shout out to all my fellow Canadians. I long for us to be first place again at some point. But you know what I mean? There's
been a search. There's been a search, by the way. There's a lot of YouTubers I watch who are wanting to go to Canada lately.
Yeah, I just think the data actually shows the other way. Canadians are actually going to the States, and that's just a reality for us. But the point I'm trying to make is not to get into that, but to say that, like, actually immigration policy is in a sense a type of hospitality, right? Like, there is a sense in which people are going to come. On what grounds are you going? What door are they going to enter? How are they going to be fed? They are going to need to sleep somewhere. And this is the big thing in Canada right now, right? We've had massive increase in certain types of immigration, and housing is a major issue. And it means greater poverty. And so that has an impact on other people, who, et cetera, right? And so thinking of it as a home and a proper understanding of a home, as you've beautifully laid out, actually I think is a very fruitful way to think through some of those policies. It's the sort of, Lakoff and Johnson talk about metaphors we live by. We all sort of live by metaphors. And you can think of immigration policy as a sort of, gatekeeping or what have you, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, we're talking about how do we live together, and who are we letting into our home, and who are we not, and on what terms, and for what reasons. And I think there's lots of biblical imagery around that as well.
Well, and complexifying that whole story, I think you have to consider also, for both Canada and the United States, and I would add Mexico and Peru and all the countries of the Americas, the internal stranger, the internal wanderer, the internal exile, right? That troubles all of our senses of, you know, when you ask yourself, well, how do I take care of my home? How do I build the home in ways that protect my family and those that I consider my kin? Well, suddenly that question is complexified and troubled when you're like, well, maybe I was the first one who trespassed into someone else's home, and they're actually still here. They're living in the basement, or I put them in the attic. And so, what does that mean for how I think about home now, right?
Yeah.
So you have to do some of that deep searching process about the history of colonization and you know the way in which I've heard many Black brothers and sisters talk about continuing after 400 years, even though they arrived at the same time as their European kin, continuing to feel not at home in the United States. Of course, you've got First Nations people who have similar stories. And so that complexifies, I think, also how we think about immigration, and even when we think about it in terms of home.
Yeah, 100%. I have a friend who's Cree from near Edmonton, which is northern Alberta, and she's Cree, she's First Nation, and she's often saying, look, you know, we invest more in development in certain places in the world, and yet on many of our like reservations, there's just not clean drinking water. And you know, we were here first. Like, is it, you know, it's sort of like saying what's going on? It's exactly what you've described. So, um, Alberto, this is just brilliant. I feel like we could keep going for hours, and let's just keep going. There is a question in the box, and I'll translate it. It's from Carolyn Brock, and she's wondering about this distinction you made about time versus place with when we're talking about our sort of Christian identity. And she's wondering, she says, well, I think actually that time and place are actually closely related, right? And I think like according to physics, I think Carolyn, I think she must have
That
been paying
applies.
attention in physics while we were skipping class or something like that. But
Yeah.
but she just said, I'm interested in the way we think about the past better and how that relates, you know, to the future. So maybe you can talk about the links between time and place, and the sort of distinction you were trying to make.
Mhm. That's a really beautiful question. And let me see if I can kind of unwrap some of my thoughts about it. I'm sure there'll be incomplete reflections, but I really appreciate the question. Um, where my head and my heart goes when I hear that question is the language of Peru. It's easy for me to say in the context of the United States, where Peruvians are foreigners and they're part of minority groups and et cetera, et cetera. I'm embracing my Peruvian identity and my identity in this place. And most people nod along and they say, beautiful, you know, that's good. Well, Peru is the name that Spanish colonizers assigned to this land that was previously inhabited by native Andean peoples. And so then you might take it a step back and you might say, oh, okay, so you better not call it Peru, Alberto, because in the past it was called Tawantinsuyo, the four suyos in Quechua. Well, pretty quickly you realize that's problematic too, because the four suyos were established by an Incan empire, which most people associate Peru with. Well, the Incas were actually just one people group among many that conquered all the, like brutally conquered all the surrounding Andean people groups and tribes and established an empire made up of four suyos. Okay. So there is, as Justo Gonzalez says, there's not an innocent history here, right? So then the question becomes, when you identify yourself as Peruvian in the present, what do you make of all the previous history of that place? Are you also a member of the Tawantinsuyo? Should you claim, should I identify, if I'm trying to identify with marginalized peoples in my own context from a kind of liberationist lens, should I not be identifying as Peruvian? Is that imperialist? All places have these complex histories, right? And the names change over time, and the sense of identity changes over time, and it will continue to change. And so, again, so if you hold like me to a sense that there is, while there's deep discontinuity, you know, when the Lord comes and there's new creation, there's true newness, there's newness and therefore discontinuity, but there's also continuity, right? The resurrected body of Christ, while it was different and new, it also held, you know, the marks of the cross, and it was still a body. If you apply that kind of logic to places and you say, well, there's going to be, just as there's going to be a new Jerusalem, there's going to be a new Peru. Well, should it be new Peru, or should it be new Tawantinsuyo, or should it be new, which version of the old? And so this is where I'm thinking, what was the question asker's name?
Carolyn.
This is where I'm thinking with Carolyn, that time and place do go together, right? That this place was something at this particular time, and it continued, and it's almost a still frame, right? That the Tawantinsuyo existed between these two. It was actually only about, it wasn't that long, that the Incan Empire existed. And now Lima and then Peru. The Republic of Peru only has existed from 1821, and who knows, only the Lord knows if it'll have an end, when it has an end. I sense that somehow all of that history, all time and place together, will be transformed, right? Maybe that's what I'll say. All those iterations of that land and all the creatures that thrived and lived and died there, somehow together will go a transformation. Because I do think as Christians we want to say that in the new creation, new heavens and new earth, not only place but time will have undergone death and resurrection, will have undergone deep transformation. I don't know if that answers your question, Carolyn, but this is kind of where it's where my mind goes.
I hope so. And like, yeah, there's a certain beauty there. And it reminds me of, like, I mean, first of all, again, physically, time is a part of the created order, right? There was morning and there was evening the first day. It's part of creation. And if sin rips through creation, that's part of time. That, there's a line, there's a Canadian artist, Bruce Cockburn, who's like, he was big in the 80s and 90s. He did a lot of stuff. Like, I actually love him. My dad loved him. So I'm sort of one of these kids who listen to a lot of my dad's records. And but and sometimes I don't agree with him, and other times I think he's out to lunch, and other times I think he's a bit of a hippie, and that's all fine, and I loved it. But he has this one line. There's lots of lines that I love of his, but he has this one line in a song, and it goes, like the stone on the surface of a still river, driving the ripples on forever. Redemption rips through the circle of time in the cry of a tiny babe. And I just think that that's sort of a beautiful thing. You've got this sort of like the incarnation is this drop that just ripples out, and it ripples out in the space, like the actual river, but it's ripping through time as well, historically, both backwards and forwards. And I don't know, I just think that's a beautiful example of what you're describing in response to Carolyn's question.
Yeah, you took it in the other direction, but in a very resonant way. All times and all places are held in Christ, are held together in Christ, to kind of cite Colossians there. I do want to point out, and I don't want to take up too much time here, we haven't really mentioned, I think there was an opportunity for me in 2 questions ago to talk about practical things that we can do
Totally.
to get home more.
Yeah, for sure.
And honestly, what I tell my students when I teach this migration and home class, I tell them, get to know what birds live. First of all, learn your story, learn where you're from, learn where your family came from. Learn where home was for them and where home is for you. Get to know what birds live there. Get to know what animals thrive there. Get to know what plants are native to there, and then find out their history and find out how they got there, because not all of them necessarily were probably native all along.
Yeah.
And then, don't stop with your creaturely neighbors. Also find out who's in your neighborhood, right? And when people ask me particularly about migrants, and how church congregations can kind of come around them and help them heal some of those wounds, I tell them when it's the right time, because immigrants have been through different kinds of traumatic experiences. When it's the right time, ask them to share about where they're from, and provide spaces and opportunities for them to bring dishes that are near and dear to them, or to share stories or music, right? A lot of the arts hold some of these aspects of home that reminds them of home. Invite their story into your story. Begin to see where the patterns are weaved, right? Where in unexpected places sometimes, where your story and their story does cross over, despite having been sometimes oceans and long distances apart. So I didn't want to leave without offering some practical tools around this. Because ultimately, I'll finish here, pilgrims are extremely placed people. They're not displaced people. they're deeply hyper aware of the way in which the holy is penetrating places, right? They go visit holy sites, and they don't stay on the road. They go back home transformed,
Preach.
seeing the world through a different lens, penetrated by the glory of God. So it's a mistake to conflate being a pilgrim with being a wanderer, or being displaced and endlessly wandering. So
Preach. Preach. Okay, love it. I love this so much, Alberto. I knew it was going to be good, but it's even better than I expected. So a couple of things just on the birds front. One of the things, we send our kids to this little Charlotte Mason school that we started. And one of our commitments is actually the kids need to know the birds, the flowers, the weeds, the trees in their local environment, like literally on the place where they are. They go out and they do nature study. And I think there's a certain, like, alluding to your pilgrimage thing, the fact that they're so deeply rooted and so knowledgeable of this place actually makes them much more interested in other places. So they're used to attending to those things, right? And so as a practical advice, attend to the birds in your neighborhood and know them, get to know their names, and maybe get to know that starling, which is building a nest in your mailbox, doesn't belong here, and now it does, right? Like it showed up on some ship.
right,
So
right, right. Yeah.
there's one question that comes from Fritz Heinzen, which is a great question, and he's addressing it to you, Alberto. He says, "How often do you go back to Peru, and
Mm,
how do you feel when there? Do you feel like you're at home, a foreigner, or a bit of both?" And then he asks, "And how do your children feel when they're there?" So I'd
mm.
love I'd love you to respond to Fritz's question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It was we left Peru in 2001, and I got my U.S. residency, permanent residency, in 2014. So it was about 14 years, 13, 14 years before I was able to return to Peru after having left. And I've actually written about this. The first time that first time going back to Peru, I got off the plane in Jorge Chavez International Airport, got outside the gates, and first thing that hit me was the smell of the ocean, because I had completely forgotten that I lived by the ocean for the first 10 years of my life, and that my family before me for decades. And when we moved to the United States, I grew up in the Midwest, so Lake Michigan was the closest thing we had to the ocean. And Lake Michigan, you can't really smell it, from the suburbs, but um, as soon as you get off the airport, the salt water and the fishiness hits your nostrils. And I thought, whoa, that was the first thing. The next, I went to my childhood home, which is now my aunt's house. And the next morning, because the flight landed at like 11 p.m., so I didn't get a chance to really explore much, I ran up to the top. Peruvian houses in Lima, which is a desert, they have open roofs where you can go on top and look out. And I looked out. I went to the roof and I looked out, and to the right were the Andes Mountains, which again, I forgot that I grew up next to the Andes. Or even I would have told you, like, in theory, that they were there, but I forgot, and I looked to the left, and there was the ocean and the cranes from the shipyard. I grew up in Callao, which is a port city. And I've described the feeling there like a prodigal son being welcomed back. I felt like the mountains and the sea was saying, we've missed you. Welcome home, son. And then about 3 minutes into this mystical, glorious experience, my aunt came up the stairs. My Aunt Nellie, whom I had grown up with all those 10 years, who had been like a second mother to me during those 10 years, knew each other intimately. And she had seen a 10-year-old little boy leave, and she saw a 20-something bearded guy walk in. And she looked at me, and I was a stranger. She's like, she knew who I was in theory, but it was awkward. It was like we didn't really know each other. We had to meet each other again. Same thing happened with my brother, whom I hadn't seen since 1993, right? All these encounters I had were like with strangers. And so there was that tension of like, whoa, I feel at home for the first time in 15 years, quickly followed by, I'm a stranger here. I'm a foreigner in this land. Um, And actually, that experience happened right before I started my doctoral work, and it played an important role in me investigating, how home works. Um, I've since returned to Peru pretty regularly, at least once every couple of years, and over time, there's definitely more familiarity. Some of those early shocking, stark feelings have kind of lessened a little bit. But what I've taken away from all that is that um, if it's true that the places we inhabit are not just containers for our lives, but that they penetrate us and we penetrate them in such a way that we are a part of the place. We're not just in the places, we are parts of places. Then I always carry parts of Peru and Callao and my childhood home with me wherever I go. And in fact, those are some of the gifts that I can offer to people in the form of stories, food, music, art. But now I also carry the United States with me whenever I go back to Peru. And my soul is kind of this amalgamation of Peru and the west suburbs of Chicago. And we spent 7 years in North Carolina. And the longer you spend and the deeper you grow roots into a place, the more it becomes a part of who you are. And that creates this kind of feeling also of estrangement when you go back to the other place, because there's a new soul that's coming in, so to say. I don't want to go too deep into that metaphor. But also familiarity, because that place you never fully left it. You brought it with you. So that's how I would answer a little bit of that question from Fritz.
That's very touching, and I think just real. It gives you the sense, people talk about trauma and they say, oh, you're overestimating that. It's not traumatic. But actually, you're talking about things being like relationships being different and coming back as strangers. That is very difficult. And I think there's degrees of that, like our family is just 5 hours from home, same province, but different culture. You talk about smell. I think, smell being is one of those things that home is like that being the first thing that hits you, the smell of the sea. And smell is one of those things that gets rooted deep in your psyche somehow, and brings back all these things that are um there. And it seems to me like there is a sense in which um that's the memories and so on. You're trying to actually you're trying to keep that gift, trying to keep that gift alive. It reminds me of like Psalm 92, the Psalm, I think it's 92. No, it's not. Yeah, it is actually. It's the one, I think it's 92. It says, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem."
Yeah.
And remember, the pilgrimage that's the connection, and they're longing for that place. And there is that sense of being displaced and so on. I'm wondering, and I'm wondering just if you could, and I know we're getting close to our time, and there's still time for, let's take a couple more questions from the crowd if you've got them. But just want to make sure that last bit of that question about how do your kids feel
Oh, how do
when
my
they're there? Yeah, like I'd love to know, like your kids have a different story, of course, So they're you, but they're not you. How does that work? How do your kids feel when they're there?
It's a great question, and it allows me to talk a little bit about trauma too. Um, you know, we're trying to raise our kids also speaking Spanish. We're trying to keep their connection to Peru alive while recognizing that they're also deeply rooted here in a way that I will never be. Um, I think we do pass on, a sense of that home that we left to our kids. I not only think that we do, I think we have a responsibility to explain to them certain aspects of why they are who they are, that come from where we come from, where your ancestors come from. And now I was talking to a colleague here at Western, and he was saying that his grandparents left Italy, came to the United States, and never wanted to talk about Italy because they left on such bad terms. It was a traumatic experience. And so his parents never talked about Italy and didn't speak Italian, right? So we're talking 3 generations down. And he said there was parts of me that I never understood, that I was never really able to reconcile why I was different or why I was like this or why I felt like something was missing. And I loved sitting with grandpa and grandma and hearing stories about the old country. And finally I went back when I was like in my 40s, and I took my kid with me. And he was like, and understood parts of me that I had never before been able to explain. This is 3 generations away from the migration, right? And I asked my parents, why didn't you tell me like about grandpa and grandma and where they were from? And they said, you know, and this is where I'll depart from his story, and I'll share a little bit what I think happens. I think it's the trauma. A lot of people that study trauma talk about the transgenerational passing down of traumas. So there's the original trauma of having left, and the way in which they left, which was traumatic. How that trauma gets passed down to the next generation is, I don't want to hear about home. I don't want to know the language. I don't want any part to do with that culture, because it is associated with deep hurt and suffering, right? With deep loss. And the way in which it's addressed is not through a kind of trauma-informed therapy, but through repression. And guess what? That trauma doesn't end there. It gets passed down to the next generation, where that next generation feels a vacuum, a hole, something about me doesn't make sense. And I see this with Hispanic and Latino families all the time, where the third generation is like, I don't understand why my parents didn't teach me Spanish. Everybody at school knows that I'm different, unique in certain ways. We have traditions that are distinct from everybody else, despite, that we pretty much look like Americans. And yet there's this part of me that I don't know. My parents didn't tell me, and they can speak to grandma in Spanish, but they never taught me Spanish. What's up with that? And so how do that's a kind of sideways way of, we're trying to figure out how to make that not happen with our kids. Not to pass on my trauma of home to the extent that I can, because life is life, and we still pass on these hurts and wounds. And we do that, in fact, by taking them back as often as we can, by teaching them the language and the traditions, but not forcing them on them either, right? As explanatory power, not as a kind of desperate attempt for me to live out my own, wounds and longings and through their lives. But I'll say this one final thing about kids. We left North Carolina. My son was born in Michigan, Simon. We left for North Carolina so I could do my doctoral work. So he was 4 months when we left. So from 4 months until about 6 years old, he lived in North Carolina. And we moved back here to Michigan. And I'm like, this is where you were born, Simon. Like, this is home. This is where your mom and I met and got married. Like, this is a wonderful place. We call this place home. And, he talks about North Carolina all the time. And I talk to other colleagues, because the academy is this job that makes you move often from one school to another. And they, oftentimes the story they have is, my teenage daughter, my teenage son, we moved out here and I just can't get them to socialize in school. And they're just really struggling to make friends. And my spouse just doesn't quite feel the same. And the advice I always give them is, take them back for a visit. Don't not talk about, right, where you just came from. Talk about it as much as you can. You cook the food you used to cook when you were there, right? The way to heal the loss of home, once you understand that's deep importance, is not by repressing it or neglecting it. It's patiently trying to attend to those fragments that still live inside of you, and turn the fragments into gifts to be offered in the creation of something new at the place where you're at, right? And so you don't have to cross continents or have a perilous journey across a desert border to have trauma of home. You can just be the child of a professor who got a job in a different state and experience the deep trauma of home loss, really. But also the beautiful blessing and opportunity of weaving together different parts of creation.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and very, very much close to home for me as well. And the fact that you named that is like, it's very much my story, and we'll talk about that over a beer sometime. And I think what you've done in the midst of that is, Aura Valencia was asking about, those stories, and I think you've just described examples of trauma and how they come about. And we've got about 4 minutes, and so I'm wondering if we just end. You just got started, but I got the sense that you wanted to do a little bit more on. Susan Kaiser is asking a question. I'm wondering if maybe this is a very just good way to end. And I will thank you officially, but Alberto, I'm just so grateful for the wisdom. It just reminds me, and if anyone's listening, about hope and about, casting doubts about the academy, just this, you can clearly see your study is being done right. And this is like, there are people who do doctoral studies for ego, or they do it because they got a bone they want to pick with somebody. There's lots of different good and bad reasons, but clearly what your study has done is enable you to share and actually acquire wisdom about this issue and to share it with people. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think that the academy sometimes gets a bad rap, and sometimes they deserve it. But they call it a philosophical document. It's just a love of wisdom, and I just you can tell that you've loved wisdom, and I'm just grateful for your sharing of it. And I'll thank you even more effusively later. I like to say I'm promiscuous with my compliments, but I don't lie. But maybe we'll just give the table to Susan, and then I'll let you sort of finish. Because Susan wants to hear more practical examples of how to support people's ability to navigate and understand their experiences of place. And you've talked a little bit about the family setting. We've talked a little bit about prayer, about churches. My hunch is that you've got all kinds of stuff to think about, and maybe you can leave us with just a couple more. And I know that Mariah, when she was organizing this, said that there are a lot of people in churches, and so maybe you can leave us with that, and then that'll be the final bit of wisdom that you impart to us today.
I think I've talked a little bit about what kind of everybody can do practically. We talked about the birds and the plants and things like that. So maybe this is a good place to add a little bit on the liturgical end, what churches can do, what ministry leaders can do, what Christian folks can do. And here I'd actually rather like to launch a question, which is, what role does the place the church is in play in your worship? Where does it come up, or does it come up at all? Could it be that of the 52 services that you have throughout the year, if you changed the entire worship service from the songs to the hymns to the prayers to the sermon to the everything, every aspect of it, could it have been preached exactly the same way anywhere else in the world? Or were there some aspects of it from what was, and I'm sorry I left it just at the words, because we need to include here also architecture and decorations and what plants are part of the worship service, and and all these things. Is it the case that there are parts of your liturgy that are informed by the places in which the church is serving and ministering? Do the people in the congregation know the history of how that church got to be there, and not just like whose vision it was, and but at that particular place, and what resources it drew on, and what neighbors it collaborated with, to get to where it's at. So I don't know that I have concrete answers, but this is usually the kinds of questions that I leave my students with as they're thinking about ministries. Well, how does place inform your liturgy? And how can it inform your liturgy?
Yeah, it's super helpful. Friends, it's 3:15, and I just want to say on behalf of Comment, thank you to you for coming, for joining us this afternoon. It means a lot to us. This is what we're trying to do to help people, our community of readers, think through these things. And Alberto, I'll say again just how grateful I am for your wisdom that was not only in the article, but we got to see the layers behind that wisdom and the sort of the depth of it, and I feel like we didn't even plumb the full depths. And thank you so much for doing all of that work, and also for sharing it with us, and then being willing to share further. I mean it from the bottom of my heart. This was very meaningful, and I'm really grateful for you and for your story, and that you were just willing to share it with us. I am grateful. This is one of those things that's an unexpected delight of the day. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for your kind words, Brian, and thank you, Comment, for this opportunity, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. And I pray this is not the last time that we all cross paths, that we have many other chances to share stories and life together. Thank you.
Yeah, and friends, keep your eyes on your inbox. Mariah will probably do a follow-up from this call. And again, please do join us, our readers, comment.org. We'd love to have you. And we'd love you to share it. You talk about, Alberto, this being a gift that you should share with other people. For me, Comment has been a gift, just because I get to introduce people like you and your wisdom. And if you're one of our readers and you enjoy that wisdom, we encourage you to share it with others, and stay in touch with us. And Mariah will stay in touch with you. So thank you so much, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.